Um, so one of the motivations for writing this paper and other papers like it are that China's been talking about industrial policy for a long time. And so it's easy for people to think that the phenomenon of Chinese industrial policy is something familiar. Maybe it's like what Korea did in the 1970s, and maybe it's related to a so-called developmental state. And I really wanted to show people that China has in fact gone through a number of different iterations in its approach to industrial policy, and that what's happening now is not only quite different from what other countries have experienced, but it's also quite different from what China did in earlier years. What I like to call China Industrial Policy 1.0 is still relatively recent. It really starts about 2006, when China launches a set of fairly traditional targeted industrial promotion policies. So these are kind of familiar for people who know, for instance, Korea's experience. And they're also relatively light touch. So China is really trying to look for those sectors that will be economically profitable for it in the future. For instance, electric vehicles. So by the end of the first decade of this century, China is putting, fairly substantial effort into promoting electric vehicles. That's what I'm calling Industrial Policy 1.0. About 10 years later, around 2016, China adopts the innovation-driven development strategy. And this is something quite different because it really represents a decision by China that they're going to invest the money and compete at the frontier. It's really based on the idea that there's a technology revolution going on. We're going to be part of it. We have to compete. And of course, ultimately that means competing with the United States. Industrial Policy 3.0 then is what happens after 2020, 2021. So in the last 5 or 6 years. And just in terms of the objectives, the crucial thing is that a core objective here is self-reliance, self-sufficiency. China really starts to not only think about competing at the frontier, but also building a comprehensive manufacturing capability that allows China to potentially stand alone. So that's why I think it's worth looking at these three different iterations. It's a great question. And what we would have said is, if we go back 15 years, these firms, generally speaking, would not have been very prominent either on our radar or on the radar of Chinese policymakers. So if you want to give Chinese policymakers credit for these national champions, it's more in the sense that they created a national orientation and they made it clear, hey, this is a good bet. This is a good direction to go. I mean, we have a commitment to, electrification and solar power that, when you think about it, China has stayed that course for 20 years. The United States has never been able to commit to some kind of consistent orientation towards this. Just to finish that up, so that then given that relatively stable policy orientation, then some of these firms have, in many cases, driven by private entrepreneurs, jumped at the opportunity and created some very formidable companies. So as we just said, the objective of the current phase is quite different from what we think of as traditional industrial policy. But also the institutional levers or the instruments that the Chinese government uses are also very creative and novel. On the one hand, we've got many financial instruments. Of course, you've got the standard sort of fiscal tools of tax breaks and subsidized loans and things like that. Then on the financial side, you have China creating a whole spectrum of government-sponsored investment institutions. the biggest of these are the so-called government guidance funds, where they're literally tens of billions of dollars that are going to, they're supposed to be profitable, they're supposed to be market conforming, but they're clearly and intentionally and explicitly policy instruments as well, where they're supposed to be investing in particular frontier sectors, in particular priority sectors, etc. The other side of it that's quite distinct is we have the Chinese government really trying to put together different elements of the innovation chain. In other words, they're saying it's not enough that we support research. We've got to also facilitate and maybe in a certain sense pressure researchers and companies to get together and really move ideas into the product pipeline and bring them out to the market. And that means setting up organizations called innovation consortia, where you link a research institute and an engineering firm and maybe a consumer goods firm or a producer goods firm, link them with a set of contracts. And then most recently, they've developed a program called Future Scenarios, where they're saying governments and big companies will be asked to set aside some of their purchasing power to make sure that a little bit of the sort of first batch of some domestic technological product will be purchased, and we'll have a sort of guaranteed market. So for the most obvious example would be, obviously they're trying to build their semiconductor equipment industry. Well, if you're now a chip maker in China, you're supposed to set aside sort of 10% of your chip machinery demand at a minimum to purchase some of the high priority domestic substitution products that are starting to come off the production line of some of the other Chinese firms. So it's a kind of a all of the above approach, where there's money, yes, but there's also direct government matchmaking, we can think of it as, putting companies together in order to facilitate the adoption of new technologies. In general, it's very difficult to measure and even think through the cost of industrial policy. Of course, there's a sort of first round cost, the resources you expend in promoting a particular industry. But then there must be these indirect costs, because if you're giving greater incentive for certain priority area, you must be at least subtly discouraging development in other areas just because resources are limited. But most of the time we think of industrial policy as targeting a few sectors within a broader industrial base. And so the degree of discrimination is sort of one sector versus another sector. But for China today, really they are, in a fundamental sense, targeting the comprehensive development of the entire manufacturing sector. Because along with this targeting of high-tech sectors, there's also a explicit policy goal to make sure that other countries continue to be dependent on Chinese exports. So China wants to reduce its dependency on imported high-tech products, but it wants to maintain the dependency of other countries on its exports, including, of course, obvious bottleneck products like rare earth magnets, to take an example not at all at random. And so that means that the level of cost is somehow bumped up to something much more macroeconomic. There's an economy-wide overinvestment in manufacturing that hurts services, that hurts certain aspects of trade, and to a certain extent, money gets poured into the industrial sector in ways that creates excess capacity, excess competition, and doesn't translate directly into demand for other kinds of either industrial or non-industrial products. So the outcome is exactly what we see in China, namely this kind of two-track economy, where on the one hand we see very impressive accomplishments of high-tech manufacturing. You gave us a list of some of these very remarkable firms that have emerged on a global scale just in the last couple of years. But on the other hand, when you look at the domestic economy, you see, vicious competition, very tight profit margins, falling prices. Industrial prices have been declining for 3 years now, and consumer sentiment is sluggish, is fairly negative. Employment growth is sluggish. So we really see a set of costs that are very hard to quantify, but also very obvious on a kind of macroeconomic level. And so I think just from a purely economic standpoint, China's economic policy mix would be better if it were a little bit less fully committed to this kind of high-tech competition. Well, first, let's just say, you're absolutely right. It's not just that they resist it, it's that they explicitly say that we do not want this. The previous 5-year plan said we should prevent a significant reduction in manufacturing share of GDP. Now, the new 5-year plan weakens that just a little. It says, we don't have the formal version yet, but from the drafts, it's clear it's going to say something like, we don't want to see too steep a reduction in manufacturing share of GDP. So that they're easing off a little bit. But so it's that, but it's one other thing as well, right? And that is that China's in its so-called modernized sectoral or industrial system is really declaring that it wants to have within China the entire complex of high value added, sophisticated manufacturing and service sectors, meaning in this case, service sectors that are dedicated to the manufacturing economy in itself. So it's clearly driven by national power and strategic concern. Of course, China would like us to believe that this is a kind of a defensive reaction against trade wars and tech wars started by the United States. But I think the truth is it reflects a much more powerful drive on the part of China to establish this kind of independent, strategic, and manufacturing power. And we don't know what the ultimate objectives are, but we see pretty clearly that this goes beyond economic objectives and becomes a set of national strategic objectives. So certainly, the Belt and Road and China's economic policy are thought of as being coordinated components of this drive. And does it meet with certain successes on its own terms? Sure, absolutely. The imports of some of the targeted high-tech components and things like that have in fact declined. And China's manufacturing exports have in fact increased. So China had $1.1 trillion trade surplus in 2025, as you probably know. So in that sense, yeah, it's working. But in another sense, it's hard to see exactly how this can be a stable, consistent, long-run policy. These are huge trade surpluses. Economics tells us you have a surplus like that, your currency should appreciate. But China's currency is not appreciated, or it is, but just a very, very little. And some of that was a kind of emergency, early Trump, keep the renminbi undervalued as a response to the danger of a trade war. But now those dangers seem to have receded, and still there's not much appreciation. So where does that leave us? Are other countries going to simply sit back while imports of manufactured goods from China destroy their domestic manufacturing base? Now, of course, some countries will make that choice because their manufacturing base isn't, enough to power their development anyway. But countries like Brazil, Vietnam are not going to accept this. So there's an element of heightened international tension at a minimum that drives this. And of course, for Korea, it really presents some tremendous dilemmas. The Chinese determination to sort of master all of these technologies is a complete negation of the fundamental principle of the high-tech economy that developed in the 21st century, which was based on the idea that different regions and different countries would have pockets of expertise in certain things, you know. And obviously, Korea was superb in things like memory, chips, and displays, and things like that, and had a clear position within the division of labor of the global economy. And now China is saying, not just temporarily, but in a permanent way, we do not accept that principle of, of distribution of global technology and manufacturing ability. So that's a big challenge, and it is a contradiction at the core of Chinese policy, that it has these strategic aims, but at the same time, those strategic aims threaten other countries economically, and in some ways push them together. Whereas China's strategic interests would be in dividing. So it's I think there are a lot of issues that in fact go well beyond what an economist can clearly talk about, and bring in lots of other national and strategic issues as well. And of course, these are issues that KIET has been working on for a long time. And so, as industrial policy has changed in Korea and in Japan, there's been a certain type of trajectory, a certain way in which industrial policy has adapted to the higher income level and increased sophistication of the Korean economy, the Japanese economy. And the development, and that's been tracked very, very well by KIET. The developments in the Chinese economy are in some ways in an opposite direction. That as they approach the technology frontier, government intervention, government mobilization has become more intense rather than less intense. These choices by China have enormous implications for Korea. And of course, most of these, Korean thinkers and policy makers and policy intellectuals have certainly thought about already. The period of the very intense and quite profitable interaction between Korea and China is over, because China really expects to replace and squeeze out most of the important Korean high-tech producers. To a certain extent, that's already happened, certain subsectors like displays. But we have to accept that that's the new reality. And China doesn't, as I said before, accept the vision of a global economy that's distributed among different pockets of expertise. So obviously lesson one is Korea has to adapt to that. Lesson two is, well, there's still plenty of economies in the world that are at least partially committed to that kind of a model. And although it's really, really hard to work with Donald Trump's America and deal with the constantly changing, tariff policies to say nothing of everything else, in a way, it's the only game in town. And Korea is still very well positioned to serve a fundamental role in that division of labor that includes the United States, Japan, and Taiwan, and lots of other economies as well. So I mean, those are the big lessons. Obviously, they're not going to be new to anybody watching this. They understand very well. It's also the implication of the work that KIET has done. There are, I think, some things from Chinese industrial policy that are very worth studying and might be worth copying. I mean, some of these novel approaches for linking research with manufacturing end products, these are policies that can be scaled down, as it were. We think of scaling usually meaning something can be much bigger, but these are policies that can be scaled in the opposite direction and used as catalytic investments from the government to produce on a hopefully less ambitious scale, because they don't need to be as ambitious. The Chinese government is trying to muscle the whole manufacturing sector into this high-tech configuration. We don't have to do that, but we can adopt some parts of it to facilitate the movement from the lab to the marketplace. And I think there's some very interesting ideas that China has adopted.